Okay. So I just wanted to name that we are broadcasting on Facebook for anybody who will be participating live so that you know. So my name is Francisca Ponchas Coronado, and I'm the founder and also one of the coordinators of the Latinx Therapist Action Network. And we are a network of Latina, Latino, Latine, Chicane, mental health professionals. And why? Because we believe that mental health professionals, mental health practitioners have a really important role to play in the broader fight for social justice, and specifically around the work of immigrant rights. And we are a healing justice network. And what that means is that we do believe that we have a role in playing around interrupting the trauma that anti-immigration, criminalization, detention, deportation, and just overall the legacy of colonialism has left and has created essentially for our communities. And so a lot of what we do is mental health education, like the one you're receiving today, but also with an analysis of systems of oppression. We do believe healing is political, and that our wounds are political, and so should our healing be political. And so what I'm going to do is we'll drop our website on the chat so that you can visit us. We have a directory of mental health practitioners that make mental health accessible for communities in need and affordable. And we also do a whole bunch of stuff, which we hope that you can check out on our website. So we'll share our website and also our email in case you want to contact us. So thank you for being here. We are so happy and to have you. And then also thank you to our member, Sandra Leon Villa, who has been our member for quite some time now, and who is opening up the space and leading the space. Sandra Leon Villa is a doctora. She's a first-generation Chicana and licensed psychologist in Nevada. And she's also the founder of Innovative Behavioral Health Solutions, LLC, which you can find in our directory. And her mission is ensuring everyone has access to well-being regardless of socioeconomic status and other barriers. And we'll also add her social media handles and contact information sometime during the session. So we're just super excited to have you, Sandra, and I'll go ahead and give you the mic.
Hey, thank you. Gracias. Thank you for everyone who registered and is attending today's webinar. And as you know, we're talking about reclaiming identity and healing through decolonization. So I know that, thank you for the brief introduction. I'm going to go ahead and introduce myself again briefly. And are we sharing the slides yet? Okay, awesome. Perfect. So as mentioned, I am a first-gen Chicana. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and ella. My parents, they immigrated from Durango, Mexico, and we originate from the land of the land of the Tepehuan tribe, which was part of the Mexica or Aztec Empire. You can go to the next slide.
Okay. Okay, well then I will add them right here.
Okay, great.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Bye.
All right. So if everyone can go ahead and mute their mics so we can go ahead and get started. So I'm a licensed psychologist here in Nevada. I focus on trauma-informed and culturally responsive treatment. I am EMDR trained. I also conduct neuropsychological assessment, which is really the bulk of my work. I focus a lot on autism assessment, traumatic brain injury, ADHD, and learning disorders. as well as working with the immigrant populations and conducting immigration evaluations. So this includes things like asylum, cancellation of deportation, but also medical certifications for exemptions on the citizenship exam. So that's a little bit about what I do. I also wanted to go ahead to the next slide. I want to do a land acknowledgement. And currently I live in Las Vegas, Nevada, which is, you know, a Hualapai or Western Shoshone, Southern Paiute land. And I want to also acknowledge that just doing a land acknowledgement doesn't erase colonization, but it does change the narrative of who the discoverers were. And if you're interested in knowing, you know, what land you're on, you can either click the link that's included here. You can also send a text message to this phone number with your zip code, and they'll text you right back and let you know what land you sit on. I bring this up because a lot of us Latinx and a lot of other folks are Native American, right? So when we talk about Native American, American isn't just solely a term that we use to describe the United States, even though that's what we automatically think about. We live in North America or in the Americas, so this would include Central and South America. And when we think about Mexican indigenous folks, we also have indigenous folks in Central and South America. But because of colonialism, the tribes aren't really recognized south of the colonial border. So we're not recognized as Native American, but we are. So in order to talk about decolonization, we really need to understand what colonization is. So on the next slide, we'll talk about, you know, what colonization means. And in a historical context, colonization involves war, genocide. It involves the separation of families, displacement or relocation, massacres, slavery, disease that was brought through colonization, right? And also forced assimilation and acculturation. So with forced assimilation, we have the banning of indigenous languages, our cultures, values, beliefs, as well as spiritual and our cultural practices. And this includes artifacts, any statues of deities that we had, altars, and they were replaced by either the Christian or the Catholic Church, depending on where you were, because ultimately we were all colonized. And so it involves imposing values, colonial values and religion, et cetera, onto indigenous peoples. And so religion at that point is then used to control behavior, and there were consequences for not assimilating. And we've seen that throughout history. So beginning at the time of colonization to the time that, you know, Mexican Americans were really it wasn't allowed to speak Spanish, for example, or we had to conform to certain values and behaviors. And so colonization, there's a focus on exploitation and extermination. So we see that either we're exterminating indigeneity and identity, and we're exploiting folks, right? So we see this not just within indigenous populations, but we also see it when we talk about, you know, slavery. And colonization is very much tied into capitalism. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a second here. We'll go to the next slide. And so although colonization is mostly associated with indigenous people, it also impacted and displaced other populations. So as it relates to the Atlantic slave trade across the Americas, this also displaced individuals, it also separated families, it forced assimilation and exploited folks through enslavement, right? And so settlers, colonization establishes this idea that settlers are the discoverers. They're the first people. So we teach history from this perspective, and Native American status isn't recognized, not only south of the colonial border, but there's systems in place that really determine whether or not someone is indigenous or native, regardless of our identity. And so ultimately, colonization seeks to erase our identity and our history. And so we have to really keep in mind that colonization isn't just physical. Colonization also is about, psychological influence. It colonizes our mind as well. And so we really need to be mindful of that when we're talking about healing and why it's important to decolonize our mind. So we'll go ahead to the next slide. Acculturation and assimilation are really mean that we're abandoning our own culture, our values, and we're replacing them with majority culture values. For those of you who've gone to, undergrad or graduate school, or maybe in the mental health field, a lot of the times when we heard acculturation or assimilation, it was really perceived as this process of adjustment, right? When immigrant individuals or families came over to the United States, and it was really just seen as a normal process, even in our research. But more recently, we've started to look at the fact that when we say majority culture, what we really mean is white culture or dominant culture or white supremacy culture. So really, these are code words because we're expecting folks to really adopt these dominant culture values and release some of their indigenous and spiritual and cultural values. So we adopt these, but what happens is that this impacts our overall mental health. And so we experience this pressure with assimilating to white culture. And a lot of the times it's associated with higher rates of depression, anxiety, social problems, and stress. And so these rates may also be related to things like microaggressions, which are like really subtle forms of racism and underlying messages that aren't very obviously racist, but they carry these messages that we either subconsciously start to believe or but ultimately impact how we see ourselves. So for example, we can see acculturation showing up from early childhood. If you bring ethnic food to your lunchroom in elementary school, then we may feel othered because people may ask us questions. People may kind of look at us funny or ask us, what are we eating? Or why does it smell like that? And so even though they're not outwardly being racist, these comments carry an undertone that we are other, right? We are not, it's easier to bring a sandwich and some chips to school. And so a lot of the times we'll do something like that because we don't want to feel othered. And so this starts from a very young age, right? That we start to get these messages that who we are and who we are authentically at home isn't necessarily who we need to bring to school or to work, etc. So on to the next slide. And so when we talk about first generation families, we see that acculturation and assimilation often is accompanied with conflict. And so there's something called intergenerational acculturative conflict. And what that means is that you have a first generation child who is growing up in the dominant culture, is maybe acculturating and assimilating a lot faster than the parents who typically are immigrants or just came to this country. And because of the conflict, because of the differences in acculturation, it causes conflict because ultimately there are discrimination and gender role discrepancies. We typically come from interconnected and interdependent cultures versus autonomous and independent culture. And so we end up having conflict with our parents. And I had this as a first gen, growing up, and my parents growing up in like a rancho in Mexico, right? Like they're not really used to the values that we are getting exposed to at school. And so parents expect adolescents to really follow their cultural values, but adolescents may be assimilating already to dominant culture values because there is that pressure that we get from peers and from the systems that we live in. And so when we present in certain spaces, these symptoms may be over pathologized, even though developmentally it's appropriate for adolescents to have conflict with their parents. This has a lot more to do with the fact that we are being kind of pressured into assimilation and acculturation. And when it comes to girls, Latinx girls, or first generation girls, there's higher rates of depression that are related to these gender roles because there's discrepancies, right, in how our culture views gender roles versus how a more independent or autonomous culture might view them as well. So overall, we see higher rates of depression across adolescence. And so we can see how these differences in culture can really affect the family unit. So on to the next slide. So how does colonialism show up today? It's important that we understand that colonialism is an ongoing structure with the sole purpose of controlling and influencing for the purpose of power. Colonialism and privilege are often maintained in the systems that we live in. So if we can continue to have systemic oppression and continue to oppress, BIPOC folks, then it's easier to maintain that power, that privilege that comes with the systems and how they were built. And so the systems include the legal system. So we see this often in terms of, biases and rulings or severity of consequences for certain crimes for certain people, specifically for BIPOC folks. And when I say BIPOC, I'm talking about Black, Indigenous people of color. Within the education system, we see how history is told, right? We think about who is writing the curriculums for our children when they're going to school. Who is writing the history books? And for the most part, this is going to be white men. When we talk about the housing system, historically, we see redlining, right? Where we were segregated and really had to live in we're only allowed to live in certain areas of town. Because if a Black or brown person lived in a specific neighborhood, then it would bring down the value, and it was really interpreted that way. And so here in Las Vegas, for example, and this happens in all cities, right? Where you have a specific area of town. For us, it happens to be the east and the northeast side of town, which is predominantly Latinx, whereas the west side is predominantly Black, right? And these are the consequences of how these systemic issues show up, right? We're very much segregated within our own communities. Within medicine and the mental health system, we see things like misdiagnoses and biases. For example, we perceive, within medicine, we perceive Black individuals as more likely to tolerate pain, and so we're less likely to prescribe pain medication because of other issues, right? Within mental health, children are more likely to be diagnosed with behavioral and conduct problems, and it's going to take them longer to get an accurate diagnosis when they already have, very limited access because of socioeconomic status or affordability. And so we see this showing up across in our systems, right? This is how colonialism is maintained. This is how privilege and power is maintained through systemic oppression and through systemic racism. And I see your questions coming in. So just know that at the end, I'll do my best to answer the questions. We'll have a Q&A section. Can we go to the slide right before that? Yep, perfect. I am on the one that says colorism. That one, perfect. All right, so it also shows up through colorism. And we see this within our families generationally where, and it originates from colonialism, right? Where caste systems were created, where those who had closer proximity to whiteness were seen as superior versus those who were of darker complexion, had more indigenous facial features, were seen as inferior. We also see that across cultures, across not just in the United States, right? We also see beauty standards are based on colonialism and European standards, right? You have a pointy nose, if you have colored eyes, if you are lighter complexion, then you're considered more beautiful. And so we perceive indigeneity and Blackness as inferior, and colonialism will show up in our work space as well. So when we think about code switching, well, we see this within our families generationally, where those who had closer proximity to whiteness were seen as superior versus those who were of darker complexion, had more indigenous facial features, were seen as inferior. And so we see this showing up across in our systems, right? We see this within our families generationally, where those who had closer proximity to whiteness were seen as superior versus those who were of darker complexion, had more indigenous facial features, were seen as inferior. And so we see this showing up across in our systems, right? We see this within our families generationally, where those who had closer proximity to whiteness were seen as superior versus those who were of darker complexion, had more indigenous facial features, were seen as inferior. And so we see this showing up across in our systems, right? We see this within our families generationally, where those who had closer proximity to whiteness were seen as superior versus those who were of darker complexion, had more indigenous facial feat we'll talk about that in just a little bit, but colonialism shows up in all systems. And in Christianity and Catholicism, right? There's a lack of acceptance for other beliefs outside of Christianity. And then spiritual-based beliefs are demonized and stigmatized. And so they're not necessarily as accepted. When we talk about within the workspace, we have values that are based on colonialism, including perfectionism, having a sense of urgency, defensiveness, quantity over quality. There's only one right way to do things. We value individualism within the workspace. And then we see the, patriarchy, power hoarding, and capitalism also showing up, which is really what's driving a lot of these values. All right, so next slide. So when we talk about how colonialism shows up, when we think about our novelas, our telenovelas, or Spanish soap operas, for example, most of the protagonists or the main stars, they look like white passing Latinas, right? So they look like the girl on the right. And really the only indigenous representation that we had growing up was La India Maria, which is portrayed as this funny character. And growing up, we thought like, oh, this is funny, right? Like she makes funny movies. We're not necessarily thinking about the underlying messages that we are receiving when we are watching her. Even within other soap operas or other telenovelas, we see that those with darker complexion or the Afro Latinx folks in the novelas are there to provide service. They are the help, and they're not necessarily playing the star, right? And so we get these messages, and growing up, you hear things like La India, right? Or te vas a poner prieta, you're gonna get dark, get out of the sun, right? We hear these messages because even in our media, we've been told that whiter is more beautiful, right? And yes, even though, the actress who portrayed La India Maria was a very smart woman, but the way she's portrayed as the help, she's portrayed as ignorant, as having a heavy accent when she's speaking, because of probably like an indigenous dialect, but also she's not portrayed as an intelligent person. And so these are messages that we're getting as we're growing up, right? And so it absolutely has an impact on how we see ourselves. It sends the message that indigeneity is inferior, and we pick these messages up subconsciously. So non-European facial features are inferior. And so even within our community, we favor those with lighter complexion, with the pointy noses, the light eyes, as opposed to indigenous and other non-European features. And so we'll make comments about appearance without even really connecting or realizing that we're engaging in white supremacy culture. And that's that psychological influence when we talk about decolonizing our minds. All right, let's go to the next slide. And so it also shows up in terms of, indoctrinating schools. Very recently, we've heard about like the schools in Canada, the native schools in Canada. And, we have the Mexican schools here in the US, and even, in terms of like segregation, but really it was a way to force assimilation, right? We see the banning of books recently in California. There was books that are banned on Mayan, Mexica, and Nigerian teachings. And so Americanization is really the goal of the educational system. So what we are really seeing is that the books that tell our history, the books that have historically been banned, are the books that really teach us about who we are, teach us about accurate history and the things that we've been to. And this has happened, across time. In 2012, in January, Gloria Alzandua's Borderlands book was banned in the Tucson, Arizona Unified School District. And this was part of the banning of Mexican American studies in public schools. So, and this isn't just happening in the United States. The World Health Organization in 2001 reported that indigenous healing practices were banned in Peru to adopt Western medicine which is seen as superior to, you know, indigenous healing practices. So you think about this and you have to ask yourself questions like, why is it important for these systems to not allow me to read about my history? Why is it important for these systems to continue to teach their version of history and not allow me access to Mexican American studies, Nigerian history, Mayan history? There has to be something, right? That there's a fear behind allowing us to really recognize and embrace our identity. So it's really important that we are paying attention to how colonialism is showing up, right? So we have the banning of traditional indigenous healing practices and seeing them as inferior. And when you think about capitalism and colonialism, now we're talking about like a bigger picture. We're talking about big pharma. The United States is the most medicated country in the world. And so if we ban indigenous healing practices and we say that Western medicine is more effective, then we see how capitalism also ties into that. Go ahead to the next one. And so it's actually the one right before that. There we go. So this results in colonial mentality. And so basically we engage in self-criticism. So we have a negative outlook on ourselves and our culture, how on our appearance, our language, our foods, even our music. And so we basically develop this internalized racism, and it's rooted in the negative and demeaning depictions of BIPOC, right? We see this not only in folks like La India Maria, but historically within African American culture, we see how, you know, there's depictions that are really condescending, belittling, and basically portray folks as inferior, right? And so when we accept colonialism, we're also accepting the historical or modern day oppression that we see within these systems. And so when we do things like code switch, right, that's also colonial mentality. But a lot of the times we don't realize it because we've developed it as a survival mechanism. And so we'll talk about that in just a second. We'll go to the next slide. But ultimately, you know, colonial mentality has a negative impact on our overall mental health. It's linked to depression, to increased rates of depression, anxiety, risky behaviors, aggression, emotional distress, hypervigilance, which is something that we see, you know, within the trauma as well, sleep disturbance, and high blood pressure. So not only is colonial mentality affecting us emotionally and psychologically, it's affecting us physically. So now it's affecting our overall well-being. And so I have this picture up here because this is code switching, right? If you have heard people say putting on your white voice. And so all of these little cartoon figures are holding a white mask. And when we code switch, we are basically buying into the false notion of white supremacy. When I feel that I have to switch the way that I talk, that I dress, that I do my makeup, if I have to straighten my hair because wearing curly hair may be deemed unprofessional, if I show up authentically, am I afraid that I'm going to be looked at as incompetent, right? If I'm going to be looked at as inferior. And so we engage in this code switching. But really what we're doing is we're accepting the fact that who we are authentically, we're inferior. And we don't realize that that's what we're doing, right? But when we're switching the way that we talk to be more consistent with dominant culture values or dominant culture views of professionalism, or even how we should show up in the workspace, we are essentially buying into the false notion of white supremacy, and in turn accepting that we're inferior. So we talk about decolonizing for healing, right? And can we go to the slide before that, I believe? The one that says, oh, okay, I think I just switched the order. We'll go ahead and go to that slide, the one after that. So when we talk about trauma and decolonization, we have to understand that it's linked, right? And in order to be able to really heal, we have to understand how colonization really resulted in generational or intergenerational trauma. And so there's the 4 C's of historical trauma, and these include colonial injury, the collective experience of the trauma, the cumulative effects of the trauma, but also the cross-generational impact, right? And so there's a relationship between historical trauma and an increased self-report of racism. So we have, if we have these ideas about historical trauma and it keeps showing up, but we also continue to experience this oppression and racism, then we're more likely to report, right? That we experience racism as an individual. But generational trauma is passed on from one generation to the next, and it's a result of living with unhealed trauma. When we think about historical trauma, this is our collective trauma, and it can result from both colonialism and slavery. And both really manifest through problems that are experienced on a collective level. And so we see that historical trauma really increases the likelihood of substance use problems and depression. So go ahead to the next one. And so let's define what trauma is. Trauma is the emotional, psychological residue, what's left over from heightened stress that accompanies experiences of threat, violence, and life-changing events. I define trauma as a normal reaction to abnormal life experiences. And I define it that way because a lot of the times when we experience trauma, we just tend to think there's something wrong with us. What is wrong with me, right? But we don't really understand that the way that we are feeling, behaving, or acting, or how we view the world is really a normal response to things that shouldn't have happened to us. And so we're having a normal response, although what happened to us shouldn't have been deemed normal. And so when we talk about trauma from colonization, there's a ripple effect that happens not only behaviorally, but physiologically, as well as psychologically. Next slide. And so when we think about trauma, specifically within like the childhood experience, right? Early childhood trauma is literally restructures our whole brain. And so this results in things like executive functioning deficits, which include attention problems, impulse control problems. We see mood disturbance, having a hard time really regulating emotions, or having anger outbursts, or not really even being able to feel anything positive, any good, happy emotions. We see sleep disturbance, and also the emotional and somatic activation with reminders. What does that mean? That means that when something reminds us of a trauma, then we're experiencing these emotional and physical sensations and feelings that are happening as a result of being triggered or reminded about the trauma. And so we know that prolonged exposure to traumatic events is going to impact both our mental and our physical health, and that these symptoms not only present themselves behaviorally, but also they look a lot like things like ADHD, and this is how we end up in conduct problems. So we end up having these misdiagnoses because we're not taking a really trauma-informed approach, or even considering things like historical trauma. Next slide. So these are the main areas of the brain that are affected by trauma. And so we have the prefrontal cortex, and this is where executive functions happen. It's right here in the front of your brain. And so we look at things like kids or adults who struggle regulating their emotions. They struggle with planning and problem solving. And then the hippocampus is also where we consolidate memory. That means we're able to store our memory into long-term memory storage. And that affects our learning. If we're not able to really store information in our brain, we're not going to be able to retrieve it or remember it. And so we're not really learning the information as well as we would, without the trauma. And then we have the amygdala, and this is the emotion area of our brain. And so here we see emotional memories. When I was during my PhD program, I was taking a psychopharmacology class, and I remember my professor just slamming his hand on the desk And he said, that's amygdala learning. You're going to remember that I taught you amygdala learning because I just startled you. I made you jump. I made you have an emotional response. And so this is why we remember experiences that are really tied to high emotional experiences. And so the amygdala is really in charge of that, but it also helps us regulate our behavior. It also helps us initiate our response to fear. It helps us really regulate our minds and our bodies and our nervous system. So these are the main areas that are affected by trauma. And so as you can see, it's really having an effect on even how our brain develops. Next slide. And so not only does trauma impact our brain, but it also has an impact on our overall physical health. Kaiser Permanente did a study, the ACEs study, so Adverse Childhood Experiences study, and they looked at adult patients, but they asked questions about adverse childhood experiences that they had before the age of 18. And they focused on 3 major areas, and these included the abuse, neglect, and home dysfunction. And the study included more than 17,000 California or San Diego residents. And what they found is that 63.5% had at least one adverse childhood experience, and 12% reported 4 or more. And they found that the more adverse experiences one had, the more health problems they also had. So this included things like, heart disease, diabetes, lung disease, obesity, stroke, cancer, and substance abuse problems. And based on research, we know that it's basically impossible to experience a substance abuse problem without a history of, childhood trauma. Next slide. So when we think about trauma within the context of colonialism, we're looking at the historical or colonial trauma response, right? And so we see not only biological changes as a result of the trauma, but these are being passed on genetically and behaviorally, right? So it's not just that our brain structure is changing, but we're also literally genetically passing on trauma, and we're passing on behaviors. So we develop survival mechanisms. Let me go back. There we go. So we develop these survival mechanisms and we adapt, and we may develop adaptive behaviors, responses to trauma, or we may develop maladaptive behaviors, right? And regardless of how, we're passing these behaviors on. And so even though, we hear things like, oh, colonization and slavery was long ago, we know that the descendants of folks who've experienced historical trauma and who were enslaved, they continue to experience the impacts of this colonial trauma. And so there's this cognitive dissonance that we experience between our history and modern day conditions and, some of the things that we know, but we're also experiencing at the same time. And so when we look at the individual level of how this affects us, we see the behavioral changes. These can include anger outbursts, domestic violence, sexual abuse, neglect. Within the family, again, the neglect, we see communication problems. So this is the home dysfunction. We see parents that are really stressed out and children that have attachment issues. And then on the community level, we have the assimilation and acculturation. And so our ancestral practices, values, beliefs, traditions, and healing practices are really abandoned. And so there's really a huge effect that we see from colonization. And when we don't reclaim our identity or decolonize and heal, then we're going to continue to live in survival mode. We're going to continue to pass on these maladaptive behaviors that we've passed on from one generation to the next. Next slide. So I wanted to show you this timeline, and we can focus on different populations, but this is a timeline for within Mexico, right? So we look at it starting in 1521, ending in 1933. Did we lose this?
Sorry, let me fix this. Hold on.
Okay. There we go. All right, so we see this timeline, and it spans from 1521, when we had the Spanish invasion, to 1933, which really isn't, it's less than 100 years ago, right? And so when we think about for Mexican indigenous folks, we have experienced repeated extreme traumatic events in the form of warfare, right, over the last 500 years. We've only not had extreme warfare for less than 100 years. And that's not even including some of the violence that continues to happen within, our countries, not just Mexico. And this is a very similar timeline, I think, for a lot of folks who were colonized, right? It hasn't been very long since we stopped experiencing extreme traumatic events, but also we're not even counting some of the things that we see, like the social injustices that are, racially driven. And so we have trauma upon trauma upon trauma, and we're not really healing, while at the same time abandoning our identities and assimilating and acculturating. Next slide. So here we see, we pretend that that first square is like when colonization happened. So we have colonization, children and women and men, indigenous folks are exposed to trauma, rape, violence, genocide. And this can also be for folks who were, brought here to be enslaved. They're exposed to all of these things, right? Then we develop these behavioral responses to the trauma that we experience. And so we see anger outbursts, domestic violence, physical, sexual abuse, neglect, substance use, right? And we add that with brain changes. We add that with, genetic information that we're passing on, and the maladaptive behaviors and survival mechanisms, right? We're passing that on from one generation to the next. And we continue passing that on. And so imagine this continuing until we are here, right? Pairing that with lack of resources, systemic racism and oppression. And so these additional traumas are exacerbating, they're making things worse for us, right? When we talk about the lack of resources and economic advantages. And so here's where we see that ripple effect occurring, and we will continue to endure these repetitive patterns, these generational traumas or curses until we heal. And so we begin to see that these behaviors are normal because they've been passed on from one generation to the next. We're not necessarily questioning like if physical abuse is unhealthy. We see it as normal because this is how we've solved problems in our house, in our family, from one generation to the next. We continue to hide things like sexual abuse. We continue to engage in substance abuse because we've been self-medicating for generations. And so we have developed these survival behaviors that we have adopted over time just for the sole purpose of surviving. Next slide. And so this is really just a graph that shows, when we talk about like the first generation that experiences things like colonization and, violence, then we see that not only are we genetically changing, our brain structure is changing, but that also results into like forced separation from our families, forced assimilation and suppressing our culture, continuing to experience abuse. It affects our mental health. We grieve, we lose generations of children, we get labeled, and then we come into this political disempowerment. That gets passed on to the next generation, same thing, right? And we continue to pass that on. And we have this epigenetic thing that happens. We've adjusted our bodies, our minds, and our nervous system to just basically be used to experiencing trauma. We haven't experienced anything healthy, so we don't know any better, but it just continues to get passed on. Next slide. And so these traumas are going to interact with other things, right? Can we go to the next slide? And when we talk about a historical trauma narrative, then we have, the psychological piece, what we see, these recurrent mass traumas, these things that continue to happen to BIPOC populations in the media. We have these structural inequalities, again, lack of equity, lack of access to services and resources, the dominant culture narrative that continues to kind of push us towards putting ourselves in this box and not showing up authentically. And then we have our personal reminders, right? Things that we experience on a day-to-day basis, in addition to our own traumas that we've, on top of the historical trauma that we've already endured. And so this kind of just feeds into each other, and it affects not only us on an individual basis, but on a community basis as well. And so these systems, again, are they keep the status quo. We see this in headlines, how the media perceives us. For example, we're more likely to see, you know, a white male described as having mental health problems versus a Black or brown male who we're going to focus on all the bad history and behaviors, right? And so the media, even the headlines are different for us. And so this is also something that carries those underlying messages that make us appear to be more inferior, or make us appear to be aggressive or violent, or whatever they want this narrative to be. And so we have these financial disadvantages. Not only were our resources removed, but we've been exploited for financial benefit across history, and we maintain the status quo with these systems. Next slide. And so again, we see these interactions, right? We know that, you know, when we talk about generational, racial, and historical trauma, you know, we're also talking about other things that we're exposed to. So we know that, like, for example, individuals who live in low-income neighborhoods are more likely to experience abuse. They're more likely to be exposed to trauma. They're more likely to be exposed to domestic violence. Children who've been removed from their home or parents' care have already experienced trauma, which is why they were removed in the first place, but then the actual removal is traumatic as well. We know that children who have multiple placements, not only do they experience rejection, but they have a hard time adjusting. Most of them attend different schools, which then affects their academic functioning, their social emotional functioning. And all of these things are maintained through systems, right? The lack of resources keeps us in poverty, and poverty is a trauma that we don't really talk about. We experience community violence because we're in poverty, right? And so we have all of these things that are interacting with each other on top of the colonial trauma that we have endured. All right. So next slide. Okay. I am on, I have a quote. Is there a slide before that? If not, I can just read it.
This is
The one right after.
yeah.
Okay, so I have a quote on here, and it says, as such, our mental health, wellness, and our pursuit of healing is inextricably bound to our collective pursuit of freedom from oppression. Oh, we're not playing that yet. All right, so let's go back to the decolonizing. I'm on the first slide that says decolonizing our minds and healing. I think it's 2 slides before that. There we go. So not only is colonization physical and about taking resources in hand, colonization is also psychological. When we think about therapy and mental health and current healing practices, these are Western concepts, and a lot of our theories and interventions that we use now for healing, if y'all don't mind muting yourself, they are really based on white male theories and that lens and that perspective. And as we know, Western approaches for healing and Western medicine is seen as superior, right? When it comes to, you know, inferior spiritual practices of indigenous folks. They're not inferior, but we've been fed that message. And so Indigenous healing really involves the connection to earth, body, mind, spirit, and ancestors. And so even when we do see interventions that involve the body and the mind, they're not necessarily including spirit or ancestors. And these newer approaches that are essentially they essentially use spiritual practices and indigenous practices aren't recognizing them as such. So again, we see folks, naming themselves as the discoverers to these approaches of wellness, when we have seen these types of healing practices from, ancestral ways. Next slide. And so when we're talking about decolonizing our minds for healing, we have to keep in mind that we come from collectivistic cultures. So our healing isn't just about the individual self, but it also involves community healing. And so when we begin to re-indigenize, value our culture and our healing practices, which often involve rituals and ceremonies, then we no longer see them as stigmatized or inferior. In Peru, for example, a maestro or a shaman assesses the spiritual, emotional, and the social aspects of what shows up in our bodies. And these are ancestral practices that have been also passed on, right? And one of the things that we know is that as cultural factors increase, so does well-being. Paradis did a study and they found that the suicide rates among a population decreased significantly when we had the cultural factors increased. And so when we're able to reclaim our identities and live more authentically, not only is there liberation in that, but there's also healing, because we can embrace fully who we are. And so I have a video of an Ecuadorian healing called Sapara of the Ecuadorian Amazon. And he's talking about sleep disturbance. And the video is in Spanish, but essentially what he's saying is our bodies and minds are too connected to this reality. So sometimes we may hear that like, oh, you're too connected to the 3D, right? In the spiritual realm. And as such, we're not able to go to Makihanu, which is the dream world, and rest our body. And so under Sapara, the way that you feel is by talking with someone about what's affecting you or what's keeping us from being able to process whatever messages were received, in order to be able to release that and allow the body to rest. Sounds like talk therapy, but at the same time, we're introducing the connection to earth, mind, body, spirit, and ancestors. So we'll go ahead and play this video so you all can see.
Cuando uno no puede dormir, es el cuerpo y nuestro pensamiento está conectado mucho de esta realidad. Y de esta realidad no puede salir, no puede ir al mundo de Makihauno. Y por eso el cuerpo no puede descansar. Nosotros en Cosmovisión Sápara, cuando nos pasa eso, lo que sabemos hacer es conversar con otra persona, algo que no está circulando muy bien el mensaje que hemos escuchado, y eso se conversa con otra persona y le sueltas, y ahí el cuerpo puede descansar.
So we see that the incorporation, right, of not only ancestral knowledge, but really things that Western therapy has adopted for healing, right? The video is on TikTok, so I don't know if you can see his handle, but it's like Dream World Progress or something like that. I'll try to share the link afterwards. And I have a couple more videos, and before I show you the videos, I have a quote. So what's the next slide you have?
Cuando uno no puede dormir.
Can you go to the next one and then go back to that one?
I used to shrink my...
There we go. So as we decolonize, and we'll close with those two videos and then we'll open it up for Q&A. But as we decolonize our minds, we also have to challenge systems that perpetuate colonialism, white supremacy, and racism. And so advocacy is needed to disrupt the systems that uphold colonialism and white supremacy, But this also includes doing things on an individual basis. So not only is it important to decolonize our minds, to facilitate healing and reclaim who we are and really embrace and show up authentically and liberated, but when we talk about our workspaces within educational and legal systems, it's really important that we continue to work towards dismantling these systems that oppress us, because again, the influence of white supremacy is maintained through these systems. Privilege is maintained through these systems. And so I'll give you an example of how we can do this even with our own children, right? We can teach children our history. We can allow them, we can find the books that are being banned and make sure that they're reading them. We can talk to them about, you know, what actually happened in our ancestral teaching ways and everything. And so an example of this is back in like November, when schools are going through like the Thanksgiving holiday and they're doing all these, you know, whatever's part of their curriculum at school. I have a 10-year-old, and one of the things that I said to him was, hey, like, you absolutely have my permission if they start talking about Christopher Columbus as the discoverer of the new world, you have my permission to very respectfully correct your teacher, right? Because we don't have a lot of control over what happens within our educational system, but we do have control over what happens and what our children learn and how they identify and how they see themselves. And so not only do we need to teach our children our history because they're going to pass it on to their children, but we need to heal because they're going to pass it on, their healing, to the next generation as well. So I'm going to leave you with this question, but also show you a couple of videos. One's in English and one's in Spanish. It's just the translation of the other. But the question really is are you going to continue to pass on historical trauma and see yourself as inferior, or are you going to pass on healing? Right? Are you going to pass on the ability to embrace indigeneity and who you are, who your authentic self is, as opposed to what we've been taught? And how will you show up in these spaces? So I'll leave you with the next couple of videos and then we'll open it up for Q&A.
Antes me hacía chiquita, me encogía en ciertos espacios con miedo de cómo me iría a percibir la cultura dominante si me presentaba yo auténticamente tal como soy. Pero después pensé en el impacto que yo tendría para otras mujeres y niñas de primera generación, latinas, indígenas, si me presentaba yo auténticamente con mi delineador, mis arracadas y todo. Y me dejé de encoger y empecé a tomar espacio y ya no me preocupo de cómo me va a percibir la cultura dominante o cambio mi comportamiento para hacerlos sentir más cómodos o seguros alrededor de mí. I used to shrink myself with fears of how the dominant culture would perceive me if I showed up as my authentic self. And then I thought about the impact that I would have on first-gen BIPOC girls if I showed up authentically, winged liner, hoop earrings y todo. And I stopped shrinking, I started taking up space, and I'm no longer code switching to make the dominant culture feel comfortable around me or to make them feel like I'm safe.
And I think that we do that so often in an effort to make other people feel safe, but not really thinking about the impact that we have on individuals when we show up exactly as who we are. So we'll go ahead and if you have any questions.
If I may, Sandra, I was just curious what people thought, what was new to them from what Sandra shared today, a new concept or a new sort of breakthrough or understanding for you.
Takeaways. Yeah.
Yeah. You're totally invited to share on the chat. También you can unmute yourself because we're in meeting mode. So You're more than welcome to.